Well, welcome, Tom. Thank you for the talk. We look forward to it.
Right, so can you see it? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
So have you got the the video on? Shall I start?
Yes, we're running. Yep.
Okay. So my talk today is about forces mailed during the confrontation with Indonesia, 1963 to 66, but start at the end of 62. I'm going to, so just by way of introduction, the Federation of Malaysia was formed in September 1963, whereby Sarawak and North Borneo, but not Brunei, joined up with Malaysia and Singapore. Of course, Singapore subsequently left. And Indonesia, as well as the Philippines, but particularly Indonesia, objected, claiming that Sarawak and North Borneo should be part of their empire, if you like. And it caused a lot of friction. And indeed, it started an undeclared war. So just a few brief facts about the confrontation itself. It was kicked off that should be 62, 8 December 62, with the Brunei Revolt, which was quickly put down by Gurkhas, with mopping up operations lasting about 3 months. And thereafter, a confrontation along the border with Indonesia started, which lasted several years, from April 63 to May 1966, although in fact the military presence continued for several months afterwards. It was an undeclared war. It was guerrilla warfare, so this was just skirmishes along the border. But nevertheless, this was a significant war. Large numbers of troops were involved. People were killed. And so it was a big deal. And a large number of Commonwealth forces, mostly British, but some Australian, New Zealanders as well, were engaged in that confrontation. I, in fact, was born in Kuching in the 1960s and was lived there as a boy for 6 years, but was never aware of any of this while I was out there. So I'm just going to watch. Okay, so that's my brief introduction. So for the postal services, we're talking about the British, not just the British forces, but the Commonwealth forces. There were several British forces post offices known as BFPOs. These effectively were the GPOs of the confrontation, and these were the hubs where mail went in and out, and they were fixed in position throughout the whole conflict. There were, as you can see, 6 of them in our territories, each with its own individual number. There were, of course, many others in other conflicts around the world elsewhere. So these were the hubs, and associated with each BFPO, there were field post offices, the FPOs. And there could be any number of field post offices associated with with a BFPO. And they were not fixed in position or time, and they could move around as required, and so they would be basically small affairs, maybe held in a tent or small what have you, as opposed to the big BFPOs. So associated with BFPO 6 to 8, which is a very busy one in Kuching, for example, here is a list of FPOs, each with its own number, associated with that BFPO throughout the conflict, and you can see there's a whole stack of them. And part of the fun of, or the interest in collecting forces, is trying to establish all the FPO numbers, where and when they were, so on. Okay, the book that the must-have book that all collectors
Tom, can you unmute?
Can't hear a thing.
Tom? Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes,
So I don't know who muted me, but
Sorry,
it wasn't me.
I did by accident. Apologies.
Okay, so I'll just start this slide again. I'll say the must-have book for anyone who collects forces in Borneo is this book by Bill Batty Smith, The Forces Postal Service in Borneo, published by our own society in 2007. And Bill goes through all the different FPOs associated with the different BFPOs. He gives the different councils, as you can see. I've given a couple of examples for FPO 136 and 573, both of which were associated with Kuching. So you have different councillors, the dates of the council. Bill lists a whole series of items that have been found. So that's not what I'm going to do in my talk today. I'm not going to go through each BFPO and FPO and give listings like this. If you want to find the different FPOs, BFPOs, and go to Bill's book. Okay, so this is my talk outline. So I'm going to very briefly talk about incoming mail. It's going to be brief because there's almost none surviving. I only have 2 examples to show you. In other words, mail arriving in Borneo to the forces. I will then talk about commercial mail, go through things like rules and rates, military and civilian options, philatelic mail, which goes from the good, bad, and the ugly. And of course, there's in many cases, there's not a clear-cut distinction between commercial and philatelic. Sometimes there is. And then I'll just to finish my talk, I'll provide a few slides of just before and after. There was forces mail immediately before and sometime after the confrontation. I'll give a few examples. It's actually, in many cases, it's quite scarce. So we'll start with incoming mail. So this is a cover sent by Betty Miller, who of course was a member of our society. She was a great collector. She's lived in the USA, and she engaged the troops as best she could and tried to get correspondence with them. She loved collecting the different BFPOs, the different FPOs. And this is a cover that she sent. Sadly, the American stamps have been torn off the front, which is a bit of a shame. She didn't have any direct contacts with the units initially in Sarawak and Sabah. So what she'd do is she'd try and just send an envelope out to the clerk out there to try and distribute it and make friends, if you like. She was very successful. In this case, she's trying to send a cover via the Royal Ulster Rifles at Sarawak. It was, as you can see, caught in Northern Ireland and forwarded on from there. So that's one incoming cover, and you can see Betty's put handwritten her own address on the verso. And the only other incoming cover I have is this one, which I published in a journal a year or 2 back, which is this interesting first day cover from Guyana, sent to Corporal Dapprich from someone called Vincent Ranchaman. He's in the first Queen's own buffs, was Corporal Dapprich Regiment. They had been in Guyana a few years before, and he clearly befriended this chap, who then tried to send this cover to him, not knowing exactly where he was. And you can see it went on a wild goose chase, particularly around Brunei, trying to find him. Didn't find him there. Eventually went via Singapore to Hong Kong, which is where I believe the buffs were in late 1966. So it probably did eventually get to Corporal Dapprich. And that's it. And why is there so little incoming mail? Well, when soldiers or troops received their mail, yeah, they wanted the letter inside, but these are hot, steamy conditions out in the jungle. Why would you go to a lot of trouble to keep the envelope it came in? They didn't. Those were chucked away, so they're like gold dust trying to find anything. So that's my incoming section, rather speedily completed. So I move on to commercial mail. So this cover was sent by Ted Bishop, who of course was also a member of our society, died a few years ago. Ted was a dentist and he worked in the Royal Army Dental Corps, the RADC, in the latter part towards the end of Confrontation. And he collected he collected forces mail. This letter is sent to his sweetheart, his fiancée, I guess, because he married her, Patricia Nicholson, back in Northumberland. So it's going the standard way, if you like. It's using firstly a GB stamp. So that's, and the rule was you could send a GB stamp at the local rates. I'll flip briefly to the next slide. This is, if you ever want to know the rates, GB postal rates, this is the book, British Civilian Postal Rates to the 20th Century by Michael Furphy. And so I picked out the inland letter rates. So the covers, the mail in Borneo is being sent at the inland letter rate. In other words, the same rate as if you were back home, which was 3p in the early Confrontation, going up to 4p in May 1965, which was during the Confrontation. Okay, it's received an FPO 573 in this case for Kuching Council on the stamp, and as a condition of being able to get the forces concessionary rate, you had to write your name and unit on the back, which you can see there, 15 Field Ambulance, and the BFPO 68 is the Kuching BFPO number. That, if you wanted return mail, you would always address it to the BFPO, because that was a fixed GPO, if you like, whereas the FPOs, you never knew who was going to be in what FPO at what time. So the serviceman would always put the BFPO number on the verso. But the only other rule that we have here is forces mail was restricted to, if you like, your closest acquaintances. So you couldn't just send forces, at least in theory, you couldn't send forces mail home to anyone you liked. It was only to your nearest and dearest. So as I bought this nice little lot from one of the SSS auctions a year or two ago. It was very nice. Here's a whole set of covers going from Ted to his wife-to-be. I call them commercial, I mean, because the main reason for Ted sending these home was he wanted to write home, and the letters enclosed. But of course, to his fiancée, he wanted to put nice stamps on, so they've got nice stamps. You can see they're mostly FPO 573. There's one FPO 136 there. One and the bottom left one actually has the Blackwell Council on. So he was trying to vary things a little. I'll come back to the Blackwell Council a bit later in the talk. But it's a very nice, attractive set of covers. So here's a use of GB stamps without the forces concession. So you could still send mail by the forces route, in other words, in a forces mail bag, as opposed to the civilian mail, to not your nearest and dearest, but you'd have to pay the full rate. So this is a cover going to Betty Miller. I mentioned Betty, she's a member of our society. She had a large correspondence with many servicemen, but clearly she was not their husband or their sweetheart, although some of the servicemen would like to think of them as her sweetheart, their sweetheart. And it had to go at the full rate, and this is the full, going at the full rate, 2 and 6 to the United States, the correct rate of postage. Interestingly, it's written out in Betty's own hand. And one thing that has been relatively little written about is how people like Betty and other people actually corresponded in the sense that she almost certainly sent this envelope out to the troops asking for it to be returned. Whether it has stamps on, probably not, though she probably sent stamps out with it. So anyway, a nice attractive cover from Betty, going at the full rate. So here's an example of a cover being sent by a serviceman to Hong Kong. This one's going to a sweetheart. There was indeed a letter enclosed. It was still enclosed. It's almost feels wrong to read it, but it was a love letter. Very much this guy stating his love to someone he wanted to marry. This, I believe, is going at the full rate, but the rates are really poorly known. So from the UK, you had 3 zones, A, B, and C, with C being farthest away. But the same rates were not used from the Confrontation from Borneo, because the USA was not all that far from the UK, but an awful long way from Borneo. So different rates were used for the zones going out to Borneo. But I would love to see a listing, if anyone has it. There's relatively little research being done on that, and not many covers going to places other than USA and Betty and the UK, and some going to Europe. So, you can see it's got an FPO 164 cancel, which is an entry cancel into Hong Kong. And there's been relatively little written about postcards. So Bill, in his book, covers a lot of covers. He describes a lot of covers, but there's relatively little work being done on postcards. Postcards are actually rather interesting because they have correspondence on. They go at the same rate, which is inland letter rate. I should say that there was no first and second class mail rate at this time, and that came in 1968 in the UK. So it's just a standard inland letter rate. You can see these ones here that the rate actually went up in May 1965. So here we've got one in April going at 3p and August going at 4p. So they're both going at the correct rate. There was no condition, as far as I can see, to write your name and unit on postcards for obvious reasons, that it took up space, limited space. But in fact, the sender on the left-hand card here has done so. So my main interest, of course, is postcards. It's very nice, and I find there's quite a few forces postcards to be found, and they're rather nice. So here are two more. The left one's Brunei, FPO 1044, sent in May 1965. That's a real photo postcard showing Kampong Aya, which translates as the water village in Brunei. The one on the right-hand side is interesting. It's an early SW Singapore cover. It's going at 2.5p from Lab 1, FPO 766. So was this underpaid? In fact, the postcard rate in the UK at that time was 2.5p. But I still think it's, but what was, and I have no confirmatory evidence as to whether, in fact, servicemen could send at that rate. This is the only postcard I have. So I assume it's underpaid. It's rather a glaring underpayment if it is the case, because the stamp is red as opposed to purple. So there's another little thing. There's lots of little things that need to be, and big things that need to be cleared up with Confrontation. And one is whether the 2.5p rate was in fact valid or not on postcards. Certainly wasn't for letters. So most of the units working operating in Borneo during the Confrontation were British, but there were New Zealand and Australian forces there, and the mail associated with those is relatively scarce. Here's a nice cover from the 1st Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. There's no use of New Zealand or Australian stamps. It's always British stamps. They can be sent, of course, to New Zealand or Australia. This is going at the forces concession rate, 4p. And here's one example, again, of another unknown. Batty Smith lists FPO 1005, which is a very scarce one, as being in southern Thailand at the time, whereas there's some evidence back in the journal that maybe it was in Sarawak, Simangang. And this cover actually supports the latter view. That it's one thing to do, of course, is to find out where that regiment was in July 1965, and it was in Sarawak. So more controversy over the FPO 1005 and more examples needed to clear that up. So we move on now. We're still with the military mail. But sometimes civilian stamps or the local stamps are used. This is the case of a Brunei stamp. It's going at concessionary rate of 10 cents for FPO 1061, which is Syria. This has not gone in the civilian mail. It's gone into the military mail bag. It's got an FPO cancel, which is not on the civilian stamp. That was strictly not allowed. What's happened here is, well, maybe they'd run out of British stamps or simply didn't have them at that time for whatever reason. So if they were short of GB stamps, the soldiers could simply use the civilian stamps at an equivalent rate, and it would go in the military mail. This one's going from Santa Claus, Greenland, Denmark, back at Christmas time. Let's cover. Here's another example. This is from very early in the confrontation during the Brunei Revolt in December '62. It seems to be paying the full rate, but it's got an FPO 964 cancel on. What's happened here? Well, my guess is that the FPO was probably set up very quickly. They didn't have any GB stamps. Indeed, they were probably somewhat disorganized as to the rules, and so they put a Brunei stamps at full rate on. And of course, the cancel doesn't go on the stamps. I would say this is semi-philatelic. I've seen other similar covers going to Mr. and Mrs. Edwards. This is certainly commercial, so this is full commercial. What we're moving on to now is mail that goes in the civilian mail. So there's always the option that if your next helicopter drop was several days away or whatever, you could instead use forces mail could go through the civilian mail in Sarawak or Sabah. So what's happened here is this cover's being sent. It's from the B Company of the Gurkha Rifles. It's going to the UK. It's received an FPO 964 cancel from Kuching, but then it's gone in the civilian mail, so it's got a civilian stamp on. Actually, I don't quite understand why this is 20 cent. The rate would be, the full forces concession would be a 10-cent stamp. And it's been sent from CEDAW, and then if it goes into civilian mail, it then gets a civilian cancel in a normal way on the stamp. So this was the alternative route, which was often used. And so this would travel in the civilian mail bag all the way back to the UK. Here's another example going at the 10-cent rate, which is, I believe, the rate at the time for the forces airmail at the concessionary rate. Rather an attractive cover, cancelled Kuching. This one doesn't have any FPO cancel on, which is fine. And it's actually one query I have, which someone can maybe clear up after the talk, is it's got anchor post written on the verse. So I don't know what anchor post is. So someone can perhaps tell me. I've tried Googling it and got nowhere. Perhaps something to do with ships, but then this has gone airmail. Okay, so here's another cover sent to Betty Miller. This has gone through the civilian mail service to Betty Miller in the USA, and of course there's no concession allowed going to Betty, and so this appears to have gone at the full civilian rate, in this case $1.15. In that case, there was no requirement for a serviceman to write his name and unit on the reverse, but he's done so, particularly because there was striking up a correspondence. So Betty would know to write back to BFPO 605 to contact this serviceman. Another attractive one is this one. Again, going back to Betty, this guy's just written Ken on the versa. So obviously it would seem that Ken and Betty probably already knew each other. This cover has both an FPO cancel, FPO 1044, and a civilian Brunei cancel on the stamps. Noting, of course, that the FPO cancel is strictly not allowed to go onto the civilian stamps. And here we have cover forces to forces. So if you were sending another cover to forces anywhere in the world, you were automatically entitled to the service concession rate. This is from a serviceman Oxley in the Gordon Highlanders. It's going to Malawi in East Africa. It's well attractive cover. The postage paid was 70 cents. In fact, I checked the full AML rate to Malawi, which was otherwise known as Nyasaland at the time, was 90 cents. So this is semi-philatelic. It looks like they put extra postage, extra stamps on to make the cover look attractive. But it's gone because it didn't need the full postage rate because it is forces to forces, I assume. There's a cover I actually picked up quite recently. It's another example of forces to forces. I don't actually know if it's going at a forces concessionary rate, or it could be that it's just going at the I'm missing the words. Not the full airmail rate, because it's effectively the second class rate because it's carrying a Christmas card. Interestingly, this one was addressed to a serviceman in the UK in the Royal Air Force and was redirected using that nice little stick-on form, which I haven't seen before, at least for any of our mail. So, nice cover. A couple more postcards, which are nicely contrast with the use of civilian stamps for both the military and the civilian routes. So they both use a 10-cent Sarawak stamp at the forces concession rate. The left-hand card was published by Limpo Chang of Longhouse Photo Supply in Cebu, Sarawak. It shows a picture of a Kayan longhouse, rather attractive. It has this lovely chop on the bottom left side, but lovely chop, but rather inconvenient, I think, for people writing out postcards, and it takes up about a third of the writing space. It's gone in the forces, the military mail bag. It's got an FPO 964 cancel, not on the stamp. The stamp remains uncancelled, and that has gone in the military mail bag, which would then go all the way back to Mount Pleasance in London in the UK, and then be transferred to the civilian mail thereafter. Whereas the card on the right-hand side has gone at the same rate in the civilian mail. It hasn't got an FPO cancel, though it could have had one. It's got a Kuching civilian cancel. You see the serviceman leaves his name, unit and BFPO number on the rather attractive card showing the sports club. It's an early SW Singapore card. So there you have the two nice contrasting cards showing the use of the 10-cent stamp in completely different ways. And then I have one on Her Majesty's, or His Majesty, whichever you take, the envelope or the stick-on front service envelope there, which of course didn't require any stamps going from FPO 964 in Brunei to Singapore. As well as going, you could send registered, so there's a registered mail bag going from the military mail, which would be separate from the ordinary mail bag, if you like. So you could send registered mail at, of course, an elevated price. This one's going for at the end of the confrontation from FPO 136 in Kuching to the Malacca Club, which I believe is still there. At the time in the 60s, the Malacca Club was certainly exclusive, mostly used by Europeans. It's probably still a rather well-to-do club in Malacca. And it's got a lovely set of cancels for the FPO, Singapore and Malacca itself. And then you pick up this odd rarity. This is from Bernard Lardner's collection. I wrote it up on the front cover of the journal. It's published some time back. This was sent by Bill Speakman, Victoria Cross. Bill Speakman died a year or two ago. He's famous for his action in the Korean War. And he was right. He sent this lovely cover to Betty Miller. Wouldn't it be great to know what was inside, presumably a letter or a card of some sort, but I don't have that. Nevertheless, it's just a gorgeous item. And on the verso, you can see Speakman W, that is his signature, because Speakman later signed a whole lot of stuff presumably to make money, but this was sent from Borneo during the Confrontation. Okay, so that's my coverage of commercial mail. We'll move on to philatelic, which comes into the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. We start with good. So the first, you can get first day covers with GB stamps on. Here's a nice example of the International Geographic Congress stamps from 1st July 1964, which presumably meant the stamps had to be, there's a lot of trouble. You'd have to fly the stamps out there in time for the first day covers to be produced. But I guess it's a nice incentive for the servicemen to buy the stamps, send them home. Here's another rather attractive one. So this is for the inauguration of the Federation. In other words, Malaysia became an independent country in September 1963. Those are the stamps published to commemorate it. And this one covers rather nice because someone's been able to get an GB 3D stamp put on as well with an FPO. Although unfortunately I can't make out the FPO number, but the dates on it. Different councils. So this is an example of a Blackwell Council. So the Blackwell Councils were used on parcels. They were rubber councils, I believe. So, which meant, I guess, if you cancelled your parcel, you wouldn't damage anything inside, as opposed to the possibility of using the ordinary metal councils. This is clearly a philatelic use because this is not a parcel. So this is these councils are rather rare. This was sent, cover was sent at the full civilian rate to Canada. Unfortunately, I don't have a commercial use Blackwell Council to show you. Bill Batty Smith has a gorgeous parcel, a large parcel piece sent back from Ted Bishop to his father in Northumberland, covered in these councils, but I don't have that to show. And then there's a whole number of collectors, not just Betty Miller, but this is Frederick Patker's, based in Austria, was a great collector of forces mail, not just in Confrontation, but all sorts of conflicts around the world. And here he had covers sent back to him. Here's an attractive one sent back at full rate. I put this in the good because he is paying the full rate. It's got nice FPO cancels, a Vienna entry cancel. There's still much to be written about how these people operated. I think Mr. Pack actually typed that out himself, his name and address on the cover. I don't think he stuck the stamps on, but he likely sent them out with instructions how to use them. This one went registered. And Mr. Packer's favorite thing was collecting cachets, and so here's a nice one of the Gurkha cachet, which I haven't seen commercially used at all. Going back to Mr. Packer in Austria, of course, again, it's paying the full rate, forces rate, and that one is addressed, self-addressed by Mr. Packer. And to me, it looks like, I think the envelope, one way or another, went back to him in another envelope back to Austria, and then he wrote the address on. That is my guess for that one, but not the last cover. But who knows? It looks to me like the cachet went and stamps went on first. And some more examples going to Mr. Packer. There's lots to collect. Lots of examples to find, although they tend not to be very cheap. Another one, Royal Marines. And this one, which I picked up, is rather nice. So this is a Forces Air letter, again, going to Mr. Packer. It has the Royal Brunei Malay Regiment cachet, so Marcus Pakusan, which is troop headquarters, Askar Melayu Diraja Brunei. So that's the Malay army or troops in the under the prefecture of the Brunei Sultan. It's got an FPO cancel, FPO 51. It's got 2 Brunei stamps going at 30-cent rate, so clearly that underpaid to Austria. And again, I think this one went back in another envelope with nothing written at all, including Mr. Patker's address, and Mr. Patker has added his address afterwards. One being one reason being it just all fits together so nice, and second reason being it's massively underpaid. And here's another example. This is from Betty Miller. Betty Miller, by and large, did play by the rules. Nothing was underpaid to her, but this one was. There was no reason why an OHMS envelope should be going to Betty Miller in the USA. But this one has. It's gone at, again, a 30-cent rate, which is way underpaid. And one great thing about Betty is many of the letters have been kept, much of the correspondence have been kept. And so this one was particularly interesting and amusing. Was sold in our auction a few years ago. So it says, it's from, I can't remember, it's from Flight Lieutenant Madison writes, "Dear Betty, I have today received a copy of Saturday's Evening Post and the Playboy magazine from you. I've made these magazines available to the Royal Air Force personnel on the unit, and I would like to thank you for your very generous and thoughtful action. I'm sure the troops were delighted to receive those magazines, and there's no doubt, and they were happy to send an OHMS envelope underpaid back, and it damn well was going to make it, whether it was underpaid or not. I'm sure that made it back to Betty. So that's a rather nice and amusing example. So now we get on to the, if you like, the bad and the ugly, which is, to me, is where, you know, things that are underpaid and you're effectively defrauding the postal services of money, which to me is the bad and the ugly. I have nothing against philatelic mail, which goes at full rate, giving postal services their money, etc. But you're starting to cross the line when you start to break the rules. So Mr. Hare was a notorious collector, and he liked concoctions, and here is one of them. So this is a Forces Air letter. It was sent from Sarawak during the confrontation. It's inevitably from a serviceman, almost certainly. It's got a GB 3D stamp on, but it was put straight into the civilian mail. So there's no attempt, as far as I could see, to send this via the military route. And of course, the civilian post office got this and immediately invalidated the stamp by drawing around it like that. It's invalid for use in GB stamp, was not valid for use in the civilian mail. It had to be a civilian stamp, but it nevertheless went. So it's, the cover went. It's going back to England, and it's received a Kuching postmark, and it had a T put on it with I can't remember the number of centimes, but it's there, and it arrived in presumably in Mount Pleasant in London, and it got the IS triangles, which stand for Inland Section in Mount Pleasant, and whoever's handling the mail there thought, we're not going to do the tax here. This is, for whatever reason, maybe this is one of our boys working in Borneo. We're not going to charge tax here, and so you can see the tax has been blotted out, and the cover carried on, no doubt, to Mr. Hare's delight, and reached him. It's 100% philatelic. There's no serviceman's name, nothing written in here. I have seen one other item almost identical, which was sold. I didn't buy it. I also have another very similar item going to Mr. Hare from Perak in Malaysia. Again, almost the same concoction. So interesting, but certainly part of what I call the bad and the ugly. Mystery for Mr. Hare number 2. This was like absolutely strictly forbidden. But Mr. Hess, people presumably lose their job for doing this. So this is strictly forbidden to put a civilian cancel on GB stamps. But we've got it here. I'm willing to bet that this one travelled in another envelope back to England, and but I don't know. But here we've got Labuan November 64 cancels on GB stamps. GB stamps are going at the correct rate, but they're not allowed to go in the civilian post like this, or post at all, and they're not allowed to be cancelled. That's the only item like that I've seen. Although I do have this one, which is my last item of this section, which is this, I call it double trouble. This required double mischief, if you like. So this time, the serviceman's put his name and unit on the back, BFPO. It's going from Lab 1 to England. Attractive set of stamps. Nice, I spotted it, and you just have to have an eagle eye to spot that the cancel in the top left is a BFPO cancel. So again, strictly not allowed. It went on FPO 166 on the 3rd of November 1964. And so whoever put that on knew that that was not allowed, strictly not allowed. And then it will have gone to this through the civilian mail, because the next day, 4th November 64, it receives Lab 1 cancels. So the clerk in the civilian post office must have seen, of course, the cancel in the top left and thought, that's not allowed. I'm going to ignore that. And he or she will have cancelled the cover, and it went on its way. So that's a very unique item. I've seen nothing like it, which would have required misdemeanors on the part of two clerks, both the military clerk and the civilian clerk, and it actually travelled with a full name and unit. Wow, great item. So just to finish, I just have very briefly, just a few slides about the before and after. I bring these in because this is a collecting area that's received almost no attention. So I'm not talking about way before the British military administration, anything like that. I'm talking about the years immediately before and the years after the confrontation. And there were British forces, Commonwealth forces were in Southeast Asia for various exercise and training, and including in Borneo. So you can find covers like this one, which is sent. Of course, there's no FPOs at this time, so it has to go through the civilian mail. This one's going at, from 1957, going at 10-cent forces concession rate from Sandakan back to the UK. And these are quite scarce and not easy to find, although they tend not to attract very high prices, which is good, so I can buy them. Although this one cost me a bit more. This is going to Mr. Knott, who is another known collector. So this one I would certainly describe as philatelic. It's going the exercises in the Kota Balud, many exercises in the Kota Balud area, being sent again back to Devon in England, at a registered rate with all sorts of nice stamps and postmarks. And these are hard to find, these covers. And then post-confrontation, well, there's a lot of Brunei material. So, of course, because Brunei has maintained a British military presence for security ever since. So you've got the Royal Brunei Malay Regiment supported by British troops. And so there are many covers to be found with both British stamps and local stamps, such as those two. Lots of postcards to find. And in this case, you can go through all the different rates. So the 4D rate, of course, went up. The one on the right hand is 11.5 pence. So in 1980, and you get them going all the way through the 90s. I presume you can still get them today, but I haven't assiduously collected all this post-confrontation stuff, but I have some of it, which is quite nice. And again, it's a collecting area that's relatively little has been written about. This is my final cover, conclude the talk. So if you, this is an example of post-confrontation cover going from Sarawak. So any post-confrontation stuff going from Sarawak or Sabah, in other words, not Brunei, is scarce, to say the least. And this has not gone at any sort of concession rate, but it's nevertheless gone from the Royal Malaysian Air Force, HBM Forces Airmail, Her British Majesty's, I presume that stands for Forces Airmail, sent from Kuching back to the UK. So I found that nice cover. So very scarce to find anything like this. And that is it. So I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Tom, in your the Brunei December, I can't remember the date, cover, which was quite early on in the Brunei Rebellion. I've got one, and I know Shananizan's got one. The reason it's got the Brunei stamps on at that date is that the corporal who was in charge of the forces post office hadn't actually arrived in the country. And off the top of my head, I can't remember the date, but that predates his actual arrival in the country, and therefore the arrival of any British stamps.
Thank you, Claire. So that just corroborates my view, which was that this was one of the very first FPOs. They basically weren't organised yet. The stamps hadn't arrived, so they took whatever they could get and dealt with it whatever the way they could. And I say this I would actually consider philatelic. I've seen several covers going to Mr. Edwards.
Yeah, I know of 3. They're all of the same date.
They're all the same date, yes.
Have you seen any censored mail, Tom?
No, not seen anything being censored coming out of Confrontation. Of course, includes, I've also seen a lot of Bernard's collection, Bill's collection.
Yeah.
So as far as I'm aware, there was no censoring of anything.
Yeah.
There's no record of any censoring.
Right. Sorry about the dogs.
Can I just make, it's John Higgins here. Can I just make a plug for the book that Tom mentioned? I've got lots and lots of copies. They're only £5. They're quite small, so they won't cost much for postage, even abroad. And they're a good read, even if you're not actually going to start collecting Confrontation mail.
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear from you so I can get rid of some of my several dozen copies.
It's a very good book.
Very good book, yes. Tom, may I show something which comes under, I think, maybe the good philatelic mail? I don't know.
No. Want me to stop share? Shall I stop share?
Yeah, might be a good idea for now.
Okay.
Okay, now if I hold this up, and you can see that it's very, very open-franked. It's very philatelic, but the address is quite interesting. I don't think I'll be able to read the address, so I'll read it out. It is got Forces Airmail cachet on it. It's to Air Chief Marshal Sir Walter Marding, GBE, KCB, Harthouse, Marting, near Fording Bridge, Hants. Now, this is in 1964. Kuching mark, of course. Kuching, 30th of April, 64. What was his connection at that time? I mean, Air Chief Marshal, presumably it's back to his house.
I don't know is the answer, but yeah, it sounds like it.
Yes.
Sorry, John.
Is that a philatelic cover? It seemed to have.
Oh, it's a very philatelic cover.
Yeah.
It's got it's franked with the current Sarawak stamps from 1 cent right the way through to $1, whole set up to there. And so yes, it is indeed philatelic.
So there's lots of nice philatelic material to collect. Surprising amount. To me, the really good items are the best commercial ones, the ones that are not even semi philatelic.
Yeah, no, I do agree. The other thing I find, I occasionally display these to local societies. There's a lot of photographic material, postcards, and also actually news photos, the official news photos, and that actually does make it interesting to the non-confrontation collector, because they can see our troops out there doing what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was very interested, Tom, to see your 10 Infantry workshop cover, because in 1962, my father was the head of maintenance at Singapore District Workshops, attached to Singapore District. And at the outbreak of the confrontation, he and the unit were immediately switched to the Gurkha division, which meant changing badges and everything. And a unit detachment was sent out to Borneo. And he was on notice to go to Borneo right the way through until we left in June of '63. It was the first time I've ever seen a cover from the detachment in Borneo.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of Gurkha covers to be had. Yes.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
They
I mean,
played really well.
there were over 60,000 troops, UK troops, that were actually involved, both naval, RAF and army, throughout the confrontation.
Yeah.
Huge number involved.
Which is good for us because there's a lot of FPOs to. There's
Yes.
still a lot of work to be done to nail down all those FPOs, where and when they were. I gave you a few queries. Bill's done an excellent job in his book, but it's not the final word.
Nope. Well, that was based on Gillian's collection.
It was based on Gillian Hart's collection. Bill inherited that collection. Gillian had been writing it up, so Gillian's quite rightly mentioned in the book. Gillian has started writing it all up and sadly passed away, so Bill completed the job and did a very good job of it.
You were asking about the tuppence halfpenny postcard rate for British forces.
Yes.
And I was just checking the postal services to HM forces overseas, and you were correct in thinking there wasn't a tuppence halfpenny rate in, for example, 1966. It was threepence from outside to outside Europe, or from outside Europe.
It's tuppence halfpenny just within the UK, but the point is the rates being charged to the servicemen were UK rates, inland rates. But as far as I'm aware, there was the postcards. So the letters all went at the inland letter rate. As far as I'm aware, the postcards also went at the inland letter rate. But then there was that one card I showed with the tuppence halfpenny stamp, which was going at the postcard rate. But it's kind of a one-off, and I think it was underpaid. But I have no factual, nothing to back that up in terms of written.
If you look at those are the leaflets they produced, which you're probably familiar with, and I imagine they did the same coming back to Europe. So if you were in Malaysia, I imagine the post office produced one of those for mail coming from an FPO.
Okay.
And for example, that it means that, I mean, Furphy's rates aren't actually accurate for mail to the forces because, for example, you don't have those. So it's simply air mail outside Europe or inside Europe.
Of course not. Furphy's book is not intended as for this purpose. It is intended as UK rates, but it's obviously a very good thing to assume that the forces mail is going at the UK rate. Then it is an excellent point, something to start with. But clearly, what you need is documentation from the forces itself to back that up.
I haven't got any documentation, but I've got a strong suspicion that we were sending postcards back from Singapore at 5-cent rate.
At what rate? Sorry, Len, I couldn't catch that.
5 cents.
Well, I haven't seen them, if that's the case. 10 cent is what they were going at.
Yeah.
So I have no real strong evidence, apart from that one card, that there was any reduced rate for postcards relative to letters. But that's, as I say, that's something that also needs to be looked at in the Malayan emergency on the other side as well. All these rates really need to be looked at.
Tom, I'll have a look at my stuff that I sent back from Singapore. I was in Singapore during the confrontation. You mentioned about the BFPO or FPO that was up in Thailand.
Yes.
At that time, the Americans were resting their forces out of Vietnam in camps in both southern Thailand and amazingly in the Cameron Highlands. I actually came across them in the middle of the jungle. I just wonder whether some of our forces were rested in a similar way or whether they were going up there for training.
It's entirely possible. So one possible explanation certainly is that was FPO 1005 and the New Zealanders, that they were sent up there for a break. And I've read about that regiment. They certainly were in Simangang. It's possible this guy, for whatever reason, travelled up to Thailand, got an FPO 1005 there. as I say, these are the mysteries that we need more examples. It's a very rare FPO number as well. There's only very few examples. So,
because also, obviously, the Indonesians landed in Johor in both the end of 64 and the beginning of 65. And can I just share my screen for a second, because you might be interested in this cancellation? That's all right.
Go ahead.
If I can find it.
Presuming Roger's letting you.
Yeah,
The host has to let you do it, I think.
You can see that?
Yes.
So that is a cancellation on both Malacca and Negeri Sembilan. And you can see the on the right-hand side, the English, Chinese and Indian. And on the left, I think that is the Malay for don't spread rumors. That's the back end of the words. Don't ask me to pronounce the Malay.
I'm trying to work out what the Malay. I know quite a lot of Malay. I'm trying to work out what the words are.
I think it's Jangan. My apologies. Jangan. I can't pronounce the next word. The back end is Kebar, and the last word is Angin.
So Jangan Kabau, we don't spread news. Angin is wind.
Is it?
Don't spread news on the wind.
Right. Okay. Well, I got that from
Which is the
Google
famous.
last night.
Which does sound like don't spread rumors. It does.
Tommy, kabar angin is rumors actually in Malay.
Oh, okay, but
yeah, but literally it's mean wind. But in this case, within
okay, but angin
context,
also means wind, right? So it can be.
yeah,
rumor.
but in this context, it's rumors actually. Kabar angin.
Okay. I know barangin angin is to daydream, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I thought that would interest you all anyway.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
I've just been looking up in Johnson and Peake's British postal rates, but there's nothing in there that helps us with the forces rates, I'm afraid.
Well, I did write cards back to my grandmother that I then received back when we came back from Singapore. So I'll search them out. Another job to do.
I'd be interested in that, Charles, because I also collect Malay and Singapore. So I'm interested in the forces mail from that side as well.
No problem.
I sense we've reached 12 o'clock, which we don't have to stop, but I sense that perhaps the questions have been asked. So can we thank Tom with a wave or something for a fascinating talk. Tom, thanks very much indeed for that. And providing everything has worked correctly, there will be a recording of this put up on the Society Facebook page. And I wish everybody well, and we will be having 2 more talks in March and April, and I hope very much to see you all then. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Roger.
Bye.
Well done, Tom. Greetings to Simon. I see Simon, who I hope is feeling a little better. Simon?
Simon is on top of the world. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that's excellent news. That's a lovely point to finish. So great to see you.
Sorry, I arrived a little late.
Okay. All the best to everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.